humbled by that. We're going to switch gears now. We're going to take that incredible wisdom and that important big picture thinking, and we're going to really have a look at what's happening. What is in play right now? What are the solutions? What are people working on to help address this climate crisis, address the crisis with our planet? There's some really incredible work happening from all the way from the national level, happening at the state level, and also at the local level. So we've invited some pretty incredible people to join us and share the work that they're doing. I think you're going to be inspired by what you hear. So I'd like to invite our panelists for a State of the Nation discussion. Come on board. Hello.
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 Hi there.
Uh-oh, where'd Amelia go? We lost Amelia.
Uh-oh. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you now. I just don't have your video.
Oh.
But
Let me try and fix that.
okay. All right, we will, well, you get back on, and I'm gonna start with introductions so that we can get going here. So we have a pretty incredible array. I'm gonna start at the national level with Michael Gerrard. Thank you, Michael, for being here. Michael is the Andrew Sabin Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, where he teaches courses on environmental and energy law. He founded and directs the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. And he's practiced environmental law for 3 decades in New York City. And he served as the chair of the American Bar Association section of Environment and Energy and Resources. We've invited Michael here to talk about the current state of play with environmental rollbacks. Many of the laws that were passed around the first Earth Day 50 years ago are under attack by the current administration. So we wanted to hear kind of what the status of that was and what's being done about that. We also have Michael FURZE. Hi, Michael. So we have 2 Michaels, which could be very confusing. So I'm going to call Michael FURZE Michael, and Michael Gerrard, I'm going to call you Mike, if that's okay.
Totally fine.
All right, awesome. Michael FURZE is the Assistant Director at the Washington State Department of Commerce, where he heads the State Energy Office. He is the lead. He is taking charge of Washington State's transition to clean energy. Thank you, Michael. That is such incredible work. We're so grateful for your leadership on this policy, helping us as a state invest in cutting edge clean technologies, responding to energy emergencies, and really expanding equitable access to clean energy across the state. This is very, very important work. It's going to strengthen all communities across the state, including ours here in the Met House. So we're deeply grateful to have you here. I think we still have Amelia on the phone. So hopefully you can hear Amelia until we get her back on video. Amelia is the program director for the Environmental Trust Department at the Colville Confederated Tribes. She's a citizen, enrolled citizen of the tribes, and her heritage is Okanagan, Moses, Columbia, Arrow Lakes, Palouse, and Chief Joseph Band of the Nez Perce. She is in charge for coordinating the planning of the department's 6 management areas to support, protect, and enhance subsistence uses, ecological functions, and regulatory codes of the Colville tribes. And she's also on several boards, including the Center for World Indigenous Studies, Conservation Northwest, Hearts Gathered, and the Nez Perce Wallowa Homeland Project. So we're so grateful to have Amelia with us today as well. We're going to start just by every panelist is going to give a brief 5 to 8 minute opening statement talking about the work that they're involved in. And then after that, we're going to open it up to questions and discussion. So this is going to be your time, you folks in the audience. If after what you hear generates some burning questions, I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A, and I will facilitate that part of the discussion. So let's start with Mike. Let's hear what's happening at the national level.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. It's a pleasure to be with you all here virtually. The environmental news that we've been hearing from the Trump administration is consistently bad. They're doing everything they can to roll back environmental regulations, including as recently as last night when it came out that they were trying to reduce the stringency of the mercury standards. But the glimmer of good news, sort of, is that they don't know what they're doing. They're very bad at rolling back regulations because they don't bother to follow the legally mandated procedures in doing that. And there are legions of environmental lawyers around the country who are poised to challenge every one of these rollbacks in court. And there are still federal judges who will strike down administrative actions that they think are improper. Just 2 days ago, there were two good decisions that came down. A federal court in Montana struck down an action by the Trump administration in granting a blanket clean water waiver to lots of pipelines that had to cross streams, including the Keystone XL pipeline. The court said that the Corps of Engineers had not followed the Endangered Species Act, and so it nullified that blanket approval. When President Trump came in, his EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, also said that the scientific advisory boards shouldn't have any members who have received any grants from EPA. Well, most academic scientists have received grants from EPA. He kicked them all out and replaced them mostly with industry scientists. On Wednesday, a federal court in New York ruled that that was arbitrary and capricious, and that Pruitt couldn't do that. Here are a few other examples of this sort of thing. Methane is one of the most potent greenhouse gases, much more powerful on a pound per pound basis than carbon dioxide. Natural gas is mostly methane. Under the Obama administration, the Bureau of Land Management, which administers much federal land, adopted regulations requiring controls on methane leakage while drilling for oil and gas on federal land. The Trump administration tried to suspend that rule to give a break to the oil and gas companies. Federal court in California rejected the suspension and said that the rule needed to stay in place because the reasons given by the administration were illegitimate and had no support in the evidence. EPA under President Obama issued another rule on emissions of methane from oil and gas wells. EPA under Trump then halted that application of the rule. The DC Circuit Court found that this was invalid because EPA first needed to go through a formal notice and comment period, which they hadn't done, so the rule stayed in place. Hydrofluorocarbons are another powerful greenhouse gas. EPA under Obama adopted a regulation restricting its release. In 2015, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, in a decision written by Judge Brett Kavanaugh before he was promoted to the Supreme Court, found that part of that rule was invalid for various technical reasons that I think are dubious. The Trump administration then revoked the entirety of the rule, not just the parts that the court had left alone. A week ago, the DC Circuit found that the administration had gone too far and should not have revoked the rest of the rule without going through a formal notice and comment process. The Department of the Interior adopted a rule requiring that coal, oil, and gas companies pay a fair price for extracting fossil fuel from federal lands, and plugged a loophole that had allowed the companies to dodge royalty payments. The Trump administration repealed that rule. The federal court said that the administration had not given any good reason for the change in policy, and it undid the administration's actions. There are many other examples that I could get into, and let me just say that all these are cases that have been decided. Many other cases have ruled against Trump administration actions. There are many more of these lawsuits that are now pending. These include amendments by the Trump administration to regulations under the Endangered Species Act, litigation about failure to implement a rule concerning air pollution that crosses state lines, a lawsuit against the repeal of a rule on hydraulic fracturing. All of these are being challenged in court. One especially important rollback that's being challenged in court, which I think has a particularly high chance of being struck down, concerns greenhouse gas emissions from automobiles. In 2010, when the Obama administration bailed out much of the US auto industry, which was in a recession, in the last Great Recession, an agreement was struck under which fuel economy standards and greenhouse gas emission standards would be progressively tightened through 2025 with the possibility of a reevaluation in the middle. The Trump administration now says they've reevaluated the standards and they say they are too stringent. Even though several of the big car manufacturers say they can live with the prior standards. The only real victims of these standards are the oil companies, which would lose a lot of business if you have more efficient automobiles. The Trump administration is trying to roll that back and is also trying to take away California's ability to set its own tight standards as allowed by the Clean Air Act of 1970. Several lawsuits have already been filed. The administration's technical justification for all of this is particularly flimsy. Moreover, it's unlikely that the litigation will be finished before the November election. And if Trump loses, the new administration in January will certainly revoke all of this. Last night, as I mentioned, there was an announcement about doing something on the way to weaken the mercury standards. I think that too is very vulnerable. So there's no question that Trump is doing a lot of environmental damage, but that damage has been considerably moderated by the successful litigation that environmental groups and state attorneys general have been waging against these rollbacks. We're very pleased to work with many of these lawyers around the country, and so there is hope that the Trump administration, however long it lasts, won't be as bad for the environment as it is attempting to be.
Thank you, Mike. That's really powerful. It's good to know that our legal system is still somewhat intact and can defend against these pretty egregious rollbacks of decades of really important work. So thank you for tracking that and paying close attention to how that's unfolding. I really appreciate all your good work. We're going to go next to the state level with Michael FURZE, and we're really excited to hear about what kinds of things are happening at the state level with our clean energy transition.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. Happy Earth Day, everybody. It's really, it's an honor. There's a lot that's going on at the state level, and that might be something that folks would expect with Governor Inslee, who I think is thought of as a climate governor and an issue that he cares deeply about. In the last couple of legislative sessions, we've had a change that's cracked open a broader political window that's allowed us to take those climate ideas and turn them into legislation that's been able to pass. Earlier in the conversation today, there was mention of the Clean Fuel Standard, something that has not yet passed, community solar bill. But 2 legislative sessions ago, we had a very big year. There were bills around appliance standards, something that is regularly rolled back or attempted to roll back at the federal level. We got a new set of standards here in Washington State. We also passed a bill, first of its kind in the nation, for existing commercial buildings to achieve an energy benchmark. We updated the state's greenhouse gas emission standards and also passed a bill around the reduction of super pollutants. The centerpiece of the legislation was what's called the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which, like all of these, is a compromise bill that's designed to put the state on a path to 100% clean electricity by the year 2045. It's a pretty big piece of legislation, and all of those have rules that are in the process of being implemented by the hundreds of folks who work on these energy problems on a day-to-day basis. Most of them are outside of the Department of Commerce, at different state agencies, different advocacy groups, and different industry participants. Tucked into the Clean Energy Transformation Act is a requirement that the Department of Commerce update the state's energy strategy by 2021. And so that's a process that we began in January. This is the third state energy strategy of its kind. And I know what you're thinking, shouldn't we be strategic about how we approach our energy future all the time? And I think the answer to that question is yes. This is a more formal process where we're convening a group of 27 stakeholders, representatives from different industries and parts of the state and different perspectives. And we're trying to figure out the ways in which we can help the state achieve its greenhouse gas emissions targets and comply with the tenets of the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which say that we'll get 100% clean electricity. The last strategy was done in 2012, and a lot has changed since then. We were able to more directly recognize the effects that the existential threat that is climate change poses in Washington State. We're continuing to deal with the aging infrastructure of the grid and the need to reinvest in it in ways that will help transform our communities and our energy infrastructure. We're dealing with natural disasters, and we're dealing with cyber threats. So we've embarked on this process, and we have brought in a range of technical consultants that are going to help us model the current situation. I think we broadly know where we get emissions in the state of Washington. Many of you probably know that because of all the clean hydropower that we have, the transportation sector is the predominant way that we emit greenhouse gas emissions. And then buildings play a large role in that process as well. So we brought in additional help. We brought in these 27 members of our advisory committee, and we've embarked on this comprehensive, data-driven, and stakeholder-supported process to reduce our emissions. This will be done through December of this year, depending on how we organize our conversations with the Stay Home and Stay Safe order in place. And the idea is to think through the ways in which the state needs to adapt policy and program and infrastructure when we make some pretty significant changes to the built environment, both from a transportation perspective and from a buildings perspective. So what we want to do is electrify everything we can. The comment was made earlier about transitioning away from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. That's something that the state energy strategy will take a really significant look at. We're also looking to do the same thing with buildings and try to electrify all the systems, heating systems, cooking systems, that sort of thing along the way. And as we add all of that load to our electricity system and we use more renewable energy to meet that demand, the technology that we have and the lack of real-time visibility into how all those pieces are working together needs to be resolved so that we've got a better snapshot of how the grid and people and communities are interacting to keep the lights on all the time. So we expect to look at changes that need to take place in the electricity sector, changes that need to take place in the industrial sector, changes that need to take place in transportation and agriculture and other areas, and develop some policy ideas to deal with some of those questions. We also want to take a look at the differences between the clean energy transformation in urban settings and in rural settings. And we want to pay particular attention to who benefits and who pays from this transition to make sure that folks in our most vulnerable communities, communities of color, frontline communities have an opportunity to have a say in the transformation process and also to benefit from it as it rolls forward. So this is a little bit of a teaser for where the state is headed, and we'll know more about how we're going to step through it at the next Earth Day. Thanks again.
Thank you. That's excellent. Really great to hear. That's pretty inspiring. It would be hard to imagine that we were going to be in this situation 5 years ago with all the work that the state's doing. So it's really remarkable that we've put it on turbo and making this stuff happen in a huge way. So thanks for all your good work. Now we're going to take it down to the next level with the local work, local for North Central Washington, for the Methow and Okanagan Valleys. And I'm going to hand it over to Amelia to talk about what's happening with the Colville tribe.
Right, fast. Isquiscum Knox, in a Masconiscum Knox. As introduced by Jasmine, my name's Amelia Marchand, and I serve as the program director for the Colville Confederated Tribes Environmental Trust Department. I'm Okanagan, Chief Joseph Band of Nez Perce, Moses Columbia, Palouse, and Arrow Lakes, a citizen of the Colville Confederated Tribes born and raised on the reservation. I'm so pleased to participate in this event and so thankful for the Methow Valley Citizens Council for organizing it. Thank you so much. With the time I have, I'll talk briefly about the tribes and the department I work with. As recognized by our elder, Mark Miller, previously, Indigenous peoples have been the caretakers of the lands and waters throughout this region for time immemorial. Our ancestors relied upon this diverse ecosystem for survival, sustenance, transportation, health, culture, economy, and community, just as we do today. Our cultural continuity, physical and spiritual health is dependent upon access to and availability of a resilient and functioning ecosystem rich with diversity. Today, the reservation includes 1.4 million acres of land in northeastern Washington state, and it contains about 4,500 miles of waterways. Lands on the reservation include fee, or private property, allotment, and trust land. Allotment properties are private lands owned in whole or part by individual tribal citizens and the tribal government, with management authority governed by the U.S. Department of Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA. Trust lands on the reservation were exclusively reserved for the use and enjoyment of tribal citizens in 1872, of which BIA also has management authority. So over 1 million acres of our reservation lands are held in trust by the BIA. Much of the tribe's traditional territories continue to be protected federal lands. 2 national recreation areas, one of which is on the reservation, 1 national historic site, and portions of 3 national U.S. forests. Our tribal citizens retain hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on the former north half of the reservation for time immemorial, the majority of which are now known as the Colville National Forest. 4 federal dams on or adjacent to the reservation are also present. 2 BIA dams on the reservation, one managed by the Army Corps of Engineers on the Columbia River at Bridgeport, Washington, and one managed by the United States Bureau of Reclamation at Cooley Dam, Washington. Based upon the inherent sovereignty and constitution of the tribes, several tribal laws regulating water use, water quality, hydraulic practices, aggregate use, and hazardous substances have been enacted by the tribal government. These laws, called codes, apply to surface and groundwaters within the reservation and are administered by the Environmental Trust Department. The U.S. EPA has promulgated water quality standards for the reservation in the CFRs, and the tribes have treatment as a state authorization for sections 106, 303C, 319, and 401 of the Clean Water Act. The tribes is also designated as a reservation covered by the federal air rules for reservations and coordinates with EPA on the implementation of new federal air quality laws impacting us. Interests of the Colville tribes in water and air quality, terrestrial and aquatic habitat, and cultural resources extend beyond the boundaries of the reservation throughout our traditional territories and usual and accustomed lands. and rely upon protections required by other tribal, state, federal, and international jurisdictions. For decades, the Colville tribes have led the way in investigating industrial pollution in the upper Columbia River, specifically the section of the river between Grand Coulee Dam and the U.S.-Canadian border, resulting with a significant lawsuit against Teck Cominco for their smelter activities in Trail, British Columbia. For decades, the Colville Confederated tribes have opposed mining on the reservation and within our traditional territories. This includes support of the litigation brought forth by the Okanagan Highland Alliance against the Buckhorn Gold Mine, which is located within the former North Half. I approach the work I and my co-workers are tasked with through the lens of climate change, food and water sovereignty, and environmental justice and protection. Our staff serves on intergovernmental and interdisciplinary teams for natural resource damage assessment and emergency response to wildfires, flooding, windstorms, and now this coronavirus pandemic. Throughout this work, we have coordinated with other tribal departments and the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group to develop a climate risk and vulnerability assessment. I believe it was last spring I made contact with Jasmine, or she maybe made contact with me, and we have completed the vulnerability assessment. And importantly, with that assessment, it focused not just on the 1.4 million acres of our reservation, but throughout our traditional territories in Washington, and even extending into our traditional territories in British Columbia and down into the Wallowa Valley of Oregon to an extent. And making sure that we're helping to fill gaps and collaborate on data and information sharing when it supports the values that we mutually have for environmental protection and clean environments is the best thing that we can do right now. This past fall, the Colville tribes also submitted a petition to the Department of Ecology for water rights to really address the overallocation of water resources within our territories, specifically the Okanagan River, which originates in British Columbia. And as soon as you cross the border from BC down into Washington, you see a dramatic change. Yes, there is overallocation up on the BC side of the river, but down further south, more out of the Okanagan County region, there's significant overallocation of the Okanagan River and the Columbia River. So we're hoping we have to take some significant broad steps to try and protect the environment that we all share, that we all are living in and responsible for. Right now, one of the things that I'm waiting on with my fingers crossed, we've applied for funding to do a climate adaptation plan for the Colville tribes. And that plan was, again, another integrated attempt with the tribe's Fish and Wildlife Department, as well as our Public Safety Department. Anyone that lived in this region in 2015, and a lot of the youth that were on the video shared previously, understand what it means when there's a significant wildfire risk and threat to our communities. And unfortunately, it's terrible having to evacuate your home from a fire, which I have also done, and my family members have as well. But one of the concerns that the tribes has had to address over and over is for a lot of the public utility districts in our region, some of our tribal communities are at the end of the line to get electrical services back up and running. And that's something that we haven't just witnessed because of the wildfires, but something that we've also experienced because of the windstorms that we've had as well. I think it was in 2012, the Sampoil Valley windstorm was devastating to the Sampoil Valley, which is on the reservation, and then extends up north on the north half, and communities between our reservation and the Canadian border. But that devastated the power grid in our area as well for, I want to say, over a week, definitely over a week. And a lot of our communities, we will hunt and fish and gather and preserve the food that we have so that when we have to have ceremonies, whether it's a funeral ceremony or another type of gathering, that we have those traditional foods available. And the instability with our climate right now, it not just creates a lessening of the native plant species and the habitats that they need, but it creates the instability for our infrastructure, our electrical grid, our water resource infrastructure, and our transportation infrastructure to get to those sites, to be able to harvest and store and preserve our food. And that's a threat that we're hoping to be able to address more with our climate adaptation plan, if we get the funding. So there's a lot of different things that we're continuing to have to address as well. We have to address what's going on at the federal level, and we also have to address what's going on at the state level, and we have to address what's going on at the local level. So for a staff that has less than 20 people, it's a really big ask. And we're constantly trying to prioritize and focus on where we can have the most impact. What's going on in the Federal Register that we have to comment to? What is the Department of Ecology going to do with water trust banking? What is going on in Okanagan or Ferry counties, or even down in Grant County, for things that impact not just the resources that we have, but the resources that we depend on. So it's a little bit about what's been going on and off the Colville Reservation. We've come a long ways.
That is an incredible body of work, Amelia. We really are deeply grateful for all that incredible work. And listening to you talk, there's so much in common. There's so much, we're on a parallel track. And I think these conversations are so important to bring our efforts together, because there's so much common ground in terms of the goals that we're all trying to achieve. Clean air and abundant water, and getting our salmon runs back. And we have so much in common. So I think these conversations are so important to tie our efforts a little more closely together. I'm just going to briefly, I'm going to bring up the other panelists, and we're going to, here they are, they're there. I'm just going to very briefly talk about what's happening in the Methow with our climate action plan, and then I'm going to get to a few questions because we've had a few pop up. But for the last year, our community has come together in this really powerful way to help define and create its own future. The last 5 years have been pretty tough, with huge wildfires, big smoke events. People have lost homes. They've been evacuated several times. Things have been pretty intense. And so coming together just happened in the last year. Methow Valley Citizens Council facilitated a watershed-wide climate task force, and it's from Mazama to Pateros, and it includes a pretty wide cross-section of stakeholders and interests from the Methow Valley. It has representatives from business and nonprofits and government and community leaders. And we've been meeting to really do two things: to really understand how climate change is going to impact the Methow watershed, and what do we need to do to be prepared for those changes. And to answer that question, like you, Amelia, we've been working with Dr. Amy Snover at the Climate Impacts Group, and she's really given us a foundation of science to build a plan around. We held a large public workshop this last fall where we heard from Dr. Snover, and we identified as many of the potential impacts we could think of, and we're in the process of taking all the feedback from the community on what are the biggest concerns and what do we really need to prioritize in terms of actions. The next step of the Climate Action Plan is going to be looking at our missions. And we are working with Roel Hammerschlag, who has done climate inventories for other counties. And he's working with us to do a climate emissions inventory for the Methow Valley. And that will give us as a community a better idea of what's our role in the global effort to reduce our carbon emissions. Where do we really need to put most of our energy to get our biggest bang for our buck? So where that's in process right now, we're gonna hold another workshop. We'll see what happens with the stay-at-home order. It might be through a Zoom webinar again, which, I think we've got a practice run here. But our goal is really to have a final climate action plan with an emphasis on action by the end of this year, so we can hit the ground running in the state legislature and other efforts to really prioritize resources to this community we've been so deeply impacted. We're on the front lines of climate change, and we've got a pretty incredible army of youth activists as well who are behind us 100% and are with us, helping make sure that this climate action plan gets finalized and that the appropriate resources come to our rural area to help us make this transition. So that's what we've been up to over in the Methow. I'd like to switch gears now. I've got a few questions. We're a little bit over time, so I just want to let the audience know that we're going to go probably about 5 more minutes, and so we'd love for you to stay. We're almost done. We've got a really powerful closing that I don't want anyone to miss. So hang in there. We're close to being done, but I definitely wanted to get to these questions before we closed. I'm just going to take a few, so apologies in advance if I didn't get to your question. One is directed towards Professor Gerrard. How concerned are you about Trump's judicial appointments? It seems that these may cancel out some of the progress that he's described.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about them. We now have 5-4 majority of conservatives on the Supreme Court, and that endangers the use of the Clean Air Act and other laws to fight climate change. We also have a large number of Trump-appointed judges at the courts of appeals and the district courts. Most of the times when pro-environmental rules are struck down is based on an ambiguity in the statute passed by Congress. So what we really need is a Congress that is going to pass good, clear environmental laws that the judges have no choice but to uphold and enforce.
Unmute myself here. The next question is, I think, for everybody. What skills do you think are most important for young people to have to get jobs in the green economy?
So I'll take that.
working in the Department of Commerce, we look at different ways to strengthen communities. And the green economy is a pretty slippery term, as is clean tech, a space that we work in quite a bit. I think that there's really room for everybody in this, as your previous panelists have noted. There's roles to play within the bureaucracy using STEM skills. There's roles to play in entrepreneurship. There are scientists that are tackling this, and there are fierce advocates that are pushing for stronger and stronger positions. So I feel like finding your passion and then developing that is the best way to lean into that work.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to take a moment to thank you all for joining us this afternoon and hearing about this really, really important work. I think there's a lot of people out there who are not aware of all this incredible behind the scenes work that's happening. So I think it was very, very important to have you here this afternoon to let people know that there are really smart, capable people on the front lines really trying to advance this vision of a green future for us. So thank you so much for your time and your energy, and we're really, really appreciate you. Oh, you're muted, but thank you. I'm gonna unmute you guys.
Thanks,
Okay.
thanks very much, Jasmine.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine, for the opportunity.
Yeah, I look forward to connecting with you all again and staying in touch as our climate plan unfolds. Thank you.
Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.
Earth Day.
Hi, Amanda. Welcome back.
Hi, Jasmine. That was phenomenal. Yeah, I would just love to thank Amelia Marchand, Michael Gerald, and Michael FURZE for that beautiful time and meaningful time. And in the words of Margaret Mead, which I love this quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has."